I'm Eddie Glaude, and I'm the chair of the Department of African American Studies here at Princeton University, and welcome to the African American Studies podcast. Today, I'm delighted to have as our guest my new and wonderful colleague, Professor Autumn Womack. Professor Womack specializes in 19th century and early 20th century African American literature, with a particular research and teaching focus on the intersection of visual technology, race, and literary culture. She's currently at work on a brilliant book entitled, at least right now, Reformed Visions, Race, Visuality, and Literature in the Progressive Era. The book examines the important formal and technical features of emergent visual technologies such as photography, motion pictures, and social surveys to Black literary culture from the 1880s through the 1920s. She has published on this and other topics in Black Camera and International Film Journal, Women and Performance, American Literary History, and Small Axe Salon. Her contribution to a published roundtable on racism's afterlives is forthcoming in J19, a journal of 19th century Americanist, and her exploration of antebellum data visualization in the Anglo-African magazine will appear in Cambridge University's volume, Transitions in African American Literature, 1850 to 1865. Welcome, Professor Womack.
Hi, thank you for having me.
Well, it's a delight to have this opportunity to talk with you about your brilliant work.
Thank you.
I want to start with kind of basic question.
Yeah.
You describe the book as an effort to, in some ways, reconstruct the way in which Black people have responded to what you call the visualization of the Negro problem. Mm-hmm. And you look at these particular four cases. Yeah. But talk a little bit about what you mean by the visualization of the Negro problem?
Yeah. No, thank you. So in the book, I use visualization of the Negro problem really to name and think through the visual strategies that both African Americans and non-African Americans were using to make sense of the place of Blacks in this postbellum, post-Reconstruction landscape. So we have things like photographs, right? This is the way we normally think of the visualization of the Negro problem, right? So on the one hand, we have kind of these derogatory, the well-known kind of caricatures, right, of Blacks that were circulating in the public sphere and minstrel shows, racist cartoons, right? But then we have this whole other archive of photographs of Black middle-class life, right, that were also being used to kind of answer and engage with the Negro problem and say that the Negro problem actually really isn't a problem, right? Mm-hmm. We are capable of assimilating and performing, or not even performing, but having or participating in American middle-class life, right, as citizens. So that's one way of thinking about it. In my book, I think about it in a little bit of a different way, right? And I really think about it as a question, right? How do we represent modern Black life? And how do we represent this tension, right, between, on the one hand, kind of the shape and structure of Black social life in the North and the South, right, and the visual technologies like statistics and photographs and film that are being used to make sense of it, right? Mm-hmm. So I'm really actually thinking about the tension more so than the easy answer that I think that a lot of scholars really productively work through. So this is kind of the tension that I'm thinking through.
So what happens, this is a moment of profound change and transformation. Mm-hmm. We see, in some ways, the social and material conditions of American life shifting, right, in so many ways. And you make the point that African American intellectuals and writers are intervening in the shifting and changing landscape in very deliberate ways. Yeah. And so we have the visualization of the Negro problem, the standard ways in which they're doing it, the tensions that you identify, and then you have what folks like Du Bois are doing, Kelly Miller, Sutton Griggs, and of course, given how you periodize, Zora Neale Hurston even shows up in here. So what exactly do they do at the level of aesthetics, at the level of visualization that in some ways respond to these transformations that you talk about?
Yeah, so I'll start with Kelly Miller, right, because he's kind of where I begin the project. And it's interesting because I never really thought of myself as somebody, or I never really imagined myself as somebody who would be engaging with an intellectual like Kelly Miller, not because he's not fascinating, but just because it hadn't been on my radar before I started this project. Someone like Kelly Miller is really interested in statistics, right? He's a trained mathematician. He teaches at Howard, right? He knows math, statistics, science, physics, all of this, right? And he's really engaged, or it really takes issue with the predominant way that racial statistics are being marshaled at this time period, right? So by somebody like Frederick Hoffman, who is using census data to say Blacks are ultimately going to die because they don't have the physical wherewithal to withstand modernity. So Kelly Miller really hones in on the visualization of the data in that Frederick Hoffman's race traits, right? And he reprints tables, and he reads the tables, and he reads the statistics on the one hand as forwarding racist data, right? But then he sees a potential in these statistics, right? And that's what I'm really interested in, him using statistics and seeing them as something that can actually reorganize the relationship between knowledge about Black life, right, and predictions about the future.
So do we see this as part of a broader and in some ways long-standing effort on the part of Black intellectuals and writers to kind of marshal various evidence to prove the claims about Black inferiority wrong? And here we see Miller in this instance drawing on his own skill as a mathematician to make the numbers say something else or say something different? Or is that too flat a reading?
No, it's not too flat a reading, but I think the stakes were particularly high at this time period, right? So, yes, Black intellectuals were always repurposing statistical information as long as the census was around, right? So I think what was different about this time period is that the way that statistical data and the way that census data was being fastened to these narratives of racial inferiority and really kind of racial criminality at this time period, right? Black criminality at this time period. The way those two things were being fastened was especially new, right? And the questions, there was a different set of questions, right? So in the antebellum period, like the question was about, or most of the time statistics were being used in the service of either pro or anti-slavery argument, right? So the stakes were a little bit different in this, or the question was a little bit more open, we should say, in the postbellum period. So one of the things that I argue in the book, or that I like to think about, is that Kelly Miller is thinking about the way that these statistics actually can ask us to see race differently, right? And that's kind of where the visual technology aspect of it comes in. And then we see him kind of raising this question, right? What can statistics allow us to see, right? And then somebody like Du Bois answering in a really concrete way.
With the Philadelphia Negro. Well, what about Zora Neale Hurston? How does she help us in this? How does she enter the story, as it were?
Well, Zora Neale Hurston enters at the very tail end.
Right.
And so this is like the late 1920s, and she fits into the picture because she's taking up the motion picture. Just as she wrote, she also recorded films. This is something that a lot of people don't know. So she recorded, we have 24 minutes of this footage that she recorded of Black Southern life. And the way she fits into it is that she's also trying to make sense of a population that was, on the one hand, deemed knowable, right? So this is the thing that if we record Black life, it's knowable as a quantity, right? But it was also kind of like the problem of Black Southern life, too, in the 1920s. So she fits in here because, like Miller and like Du Bois and like some of the actors I look at in the third chapter when I'm talking about photography, she's really interested in this tension between the movement and the progress of Black social life and the limitations or the capacities of the visual technology. So for her, it's the camera and Black folk life, right? Which for her was always in motion, always in movement. So how do we reconcile the movement that's constitutive of Black folk life with the camera, which is instrument of capture and objectification? And I think this is what Kelly Miller was also up to with the statistics, right? How do we reconcile statistics with kind of the movement or the pulse of Black urban, and for him, urban and rural life, right? And this is kind of Du Bois and the Philadelphia Negro. So that's also kind of the question that animates. So
let's step back a bit, though, because that's a long arc.
It's a long arc.
Kelly Miller to Zora Neale Hurston.
Yeah.
There's this, I'm a bit obsessed about periodization for a variety of reasons. But this notion of the long 19th century, what analytical work is it doing? What what does it mean for you to end this book
Right.
with Zora Neale Hurston in that sense?
Yeah. So this is a question that I think about a lot because the long 19th century, it just seems like keep getting pushing back further and further and further. Yeah. So people are like the 1930s, like is it the 1940s? I think as the further we get, like the longer the 19th century can get. But for me, what I think is really interesting is that by isolating these four cases, right? So from Kelly Miller to Du Bois, and the third chapter is kind of a motley crew of performers and photographers. And then Zora Neale Hurston, right? I think we constellate a different relationship between the actors that we normally think of as organizing the 19th century, or at least the postbellum era, right? So Kelly Miller and Zora Neale Hurston are never thought of as in the same sentence.
Right.
Like I don't think there's ever I can't think of a word.
This is the first time I've used them in the same sentence.
And so I think that one of the things that I am trying to do by asking or posing a different question, right? So the question that animates the book is not so much what did the Negro problem look like, but how was the Negro problem constructed in visual technologies, right? I think by asking that question, we see a different set of actors engaging with each other in unexpected and really oblique ways, right? But also a different archive comes to the surface, right?
Talk a little bit about this archive, because your archive is eclectic.
It's very eclectic, yeah. So the archive includes things like the social survey, right? Which was one of the predominant modes of collecting information and organizing information about late 19th and early 20th century urban and rural life. And so I spend a lot of time thinking about and working through a capacious body of surveys. So everything from Charities and Commons, which was, they put out a number of social studies, they would call them, of Negro life, but then also like Polish life and the Italian life. And so I spend some time looking at that, and then I look at the Philadelphia Negro, right? And what these things all have in common is that they were all trying to resituate the public's relationship to the social world, right? What can we show you about the social that you can't see at first glance, right? So pulling back a curtain. So that's one of the archives. And in addition to that, to the documents themselves, right, I look at lesson plans and syllabi of sociology instructors who are teaching the social survey, right, what they have to say about it. And one of the things that's really interesting is that they all talk about it as a visual technology. So they all say that this was a camera that could shed light on something we hadn't seen, or a microscope, or it illuminates an otherwise invisible world. And so just thinking about the archive, right, the material documents themselves and the primary documents, but then also thinking about kind of where those take you, which is...
Right. So talk a little bit more about the social survey. How do you, as a literary critic, how do you read that form? I mean, I see the way in which Du Bois's The Philadelphia Negro works within the book. The Commons and Charities, the Negro City in the North. But the survey, you read it as a particular form. Yeah. So say a little bit more about that.
Yeah. So one of the things that I found when I started working with the social survey is that many of the Black writers or novelists or fiction writers or poets that I was interested in were also either contributing to social surveys or writing social surveys of their own. So even in that, the 1905 Charities and Commons, Negro in the Cities of the North, right, which was kind of a big, capacious study of Black urban life, there's everybody contributing to that, like Fannie Barrier Williams and James Weldon Johnson and Du Bois and Booker T. Washington. So all of these figures that are suddenly put together in this space, right? So on the one hand, so I started thinking about it that way, right? Like they're all contributing to the social survey. And then as I began to look through the survey and think of it as a literary form, right? I think of it as a genre, a literary genre.
Okay, that's better.
Right? It seemed, or I noticed that it had a lot in common with the form and the conventions of fiction of that time period. So, like Du Bois's Quest of the Silver Fleece, right? He actually calls that an economic study, which is the same thing that he calls, or the same categorization that he gives to the Philadelphia Negro, right? So that got me thinking, how are these two things in conversation with each other? And then I started thinking of texts that were odd or didn't quite fit into any, just kind of stand out, right? So Sutton Griggs's Imperium and Imperio, right?
Okay, say a little bit more about Sutton Griggs's Imperium and Imperio. I mean, I've always been fascinated and attracted to that work.
So Imperium and Imperio, which I also love, is this weird novel that was published in 1899 by Sutton Griggs, who was a Baptist minister, novelist, publisher, all of these things that everybody in the 19th century was, right? And so the novel tells the story of these two parallel characters, right? And one who seems to have all the opportunities in the world, and the other who really grew up in poverty and, struggles, right? But they lead these parallel lives, and they both converge at the end in this imaginary black secret government called the Imperium, where they have this oratorical battle or standoff. And so I always loved the novel, and one of the things that I found when I began researching it is that Kelly Miller, right, who makes an appearance in the first chapter of the book, or who is a big part of the first chapter of the book, reviewed Imperium and Imperio, right? And so we can see how, like, all of these chapters that seem not connected, actually, these guys did all connect with one another. So when Kelly Miller reviewed Imperium and Imperio, he classified it as a text that did the work that Frederick Hoffman's Race Traits couldn't do, right? So he used very similar language. So in his review of Hoffman's Race Traits, which was the first of the American Negro Academy's published papers, right? He said, Hoffman's Race Traits, it's a racist text. It gets it all wrong, but it gives a really comprehensive overview, right? It does do that. And so he used really similar language, but just praised Imperium and Imperio, right? It gives a comprehensive overview. It is the text that does or can do what Race Traits fail to do, right? So this got me thinking about, okay, what is it about Imperium and Imperio? Like, what is Imperium and Imperio doing that Hoffman failed to do with the statistical, right? So the questions that emerged were, okay, how does fiction then answer or repair the statistical, but also operate as another mode or another kind of social scientific document? So I
fiction functioning as a kind of social scientific document.
Yeah, okay. Because he named it as such, right? And then this also, led me to The Quest of the Silver Fleece, right, which Du Bois also names as an economic study. So the original question that got me interested in these two texts was, okay, what does it mean to think of them as economic studies or as social scientific studies, right? As more than fiction, or not more than fiction, but fiction and, right?
Yeah, I was thinking as you were talking, Sutton Griggs's novel comes to me through a kind of black nationalist genealogy.
Yeah.
Right? That book is often read as a central text in the black nationalist 19th century black nationalist imaginary, right? And so it leads me to think about this period that you're covering. I mean, we talked about social, significant shifts as social and material conditions of black life, but it's also a time of extreme white retrenchment, right? Extreme violence in some ways, violence that leads to displacement, a trickle that will soon become a flood as people are moving, right? Not just simply moving from rural countryside, from the south to the north, but rural countryside to cities and changing their relation to labor discipline and whatnot. So I'm wondering, just ideologically, right, as these different black ideological responses emerge, right, might the visual technologies shift according to the ideological purposes to which they're being deployed, right? And to put it more concretely, right, what does it mean for someone who's making the argument that we would ascribe to a black nationalist to be engaged in this kind of work in this moment. Kelly Miller is a unique figure. Du Bois at a certain point in his career, right? So, because folks are trying to make sense of what's happening, as you rightly know.
Right. Yeah. So, two things pop into my mind. The first thing is that, and this is something that I'm just interested in more broadly, or that I'm curious about, is the way that these certain the way that we classify or think about certain texts in relationship to political and social movements like Imperium and Imperio and Black nationalism, right, are actually a reading that we ascribe to them, right? So I'm not sure that Sutton Griggs
saw himself doing
that, right? So it's like when these texts reemerged, I think Imperium and Imperio reemerged in like 1969, right? That then we not repurpose it, right? But we see the Black nationalist strands coming through, or we see it as something that's part of that is more in keeping with the Black Arts movement than in something like Kelly Miller, right? Like Kelly Miller would never make a reappearance in the 1960s. So I think it's useful to kind of suspend the work that we need the text to do now, or at that particular moment when they reemerge, from, or parse that out from the work that in 1899 Black folks needed the text to do.
So that's that's a really interesting claim. I mean, so that is to say, you want to bracket the kind of presentist preoccupation that may overdetermine the archive, right? That this work gets placed within a set of broader concerns that animate what I'm doing now, as opposed to what was motivating then. So let me ask you, since we're talking about motivation, let me ask you this then. So as a literary scholar who actually is very, very attentive to these historical sources, right? I mean, what motivates how you approach the period as a literary scholar? I mean, I'm always driven by presentist preoccupations when I return to the archive. I'm always thinking that the present is always in need of a past to account for itself, and particularly the newly emergent is always seeking an archive to ground it in some way. So, what motivates you when you return to this period or these moments?
Yeah, when I return to these moments, I'm really thinking about two things. First, I'm thinking about how these texts were operating and answering the needs and the questions of their writers and of their readers, right? So it really, in that way, is kind of an archivally based, like, historicist project, right? So that's on the one hand. But where that came from is me doing a lot of work in graduate school and doing a lot of reading and going to a lot of talks and hearing scholars and my colleagues and my classmates and my professors talking a lot about our contemporary needs and demands, right? And me thinking, this is exactly what Du Bois was talking about in 1899. This sounds exactly the literary experiments that you're naming as 21st century actually were shaping someone like Sutton Griggs, right? So it was me seeing resonances between our contemporary moment and the work that we're asking literary texts to do now, right? I saw overlaps, right? Or I wanted to chart a different or longer history, right? So in that way, it's not that different from what you're naming
it's not that
at all. But I am really invested in thinking about how these texts were taken up and circulated and read in their period. And I think that question reveals all of these unexpected and surprising overlaps, right? And it's a different constellation of the period where we can see how we get to from somebody like Kelly Miller to Sutton Griggs to Du Bois in the 1910s to then maybe Zora Neale Hurston, because why not? Right.
So, but this seems to me such a critical part of what we do in African American studies, right? That it's not that this kind of the eclectic nature of your archive, the scope of the work, the attentiveness to the complexity of Black life on the ground, trying in some ways to show how these aesthetic and visual strategies, if I'm reading you correctly, open up the ways in which Black folk are navigating substantive social and economic change that's often obscured by visual technologies that seek to justify their subordination, right? There's this ongoing work to kind of reveal the complexity and nuance of Black folks' ways of being in the world.
100%.
Right.
Yeah.
So this is really fascinating to me. So how does this shape the next projects? I heard a hint of it with regards to this kind of reprinting of old 19th. You're still in the 19th century,
I'm
even
still
though
in the
you want to go
19th
into the
century.
20th century. So talk a little bit about your next project.
So the next project is an exploration of, or it's really a book, history of the book project. I'm looking at this moment in the late 1960s that was named the reprint revolution, right, where all of these texts from the 1900s were being reprinted. And I'm thinking about the way that the reprinting of those 19th century texts shaped and informed the formation of Black Studies programs. And so I'm looking at this I really started this project, or I really started asking these questions because I became interested in Arno Press, right? Because all of the 19th century texts that I read are most of the first edition the first reprinting in the 20th century was by Arno Press. So I had all of these questions about who was Arno Press, what was their politics. And I originally imagined that there would be a smooth line of connection between the titles that the press was putting out and the titles that were then canonized in African American literary studies and the texts that were taken up in Black Studies programs. But there was a total disconnect when I actually looked at the title sheets, right, and what was being taught or what was being taken up as kind of the texts, right, the canonical texts. So Arno Press was publishing things that we now think of as obscure and that are having a resurgence now, like Elizabeth Keckley's House Behind the Scenes of whatever it's called, her expose of living and working in the White House, right? Or Charles Ball's slave narrative that nobody reads not for a very good reason, but it's just long and tedious, right? So they reprinted over 200 titles of 19th century Black texts, and many of them are canonical, like the 1845 Frederick Douglass narrative, but a lot of them aren't. So part of the project is thinking about that, right? This disconnect. And they saw their project as doing historical recovery and, quote, not the political work, right, of Black Studies programs. And then I'm really interested in Black bookstores, right, that were also emerging with a vengeance at this time period. So I'm looking at Marcus Books that was in Oakland. And I've been looking at their order forms and their requests from libraries. What should we order for our new section on, quote, Negro life, right? So I'm thinking about the ways that this question of readerly demand, right, what the field needs, how we think we should be remembering the past, right, how all of these things informed or were informed also really by printing practices, right?
So it's really fascinating to kind of think about, because intuitively you would think there would be a connect.
And there is a bit of a connect, but I was shocked when I found all of these meeting minutes from Arno Press, kind of their board meetings about what their vision was. And it was really similar to, I think it was similar to a lot of the way that the past was being reconstructed or marshaled at this time period, right? So I'm thinking of that 1968, I think it was Life magazine, where it was like Frederick Douglass's daguerreotype on the cover, and it was called The Black Past, right? It's a very particular way of remembering the Black past. So the Historical Recovery Project is certainly part, right, of the formation of some of these Black Studies programs. But they also they named their work as not radical, not political, right?
So they weren't kind of caught up in a certain kind of ideological rendering of what African American studies or Black studies is and what it would become. Exactly,
not not in that, or not exactly. So it's in its very early stages, but I'm really excited about thinking about that.
Well, I would like to thank Professor Autumn Womack for joining us today. We're so looking forward to the book, Reformed Vision, Race, Visuality and Literature, 1880 to 1930. I'm really looking forward to the next project on reprint culture in the mid-19th. That's because of my own 20th century.
I'm excited for that one too.
Yeah, this is really exciting. And I want to thank you for joining us for the discussion today. Additionally, special thanks to Courtney Bryan for providing the music to this podcast. To the staff of the Department of African American Studies at Princeton University, our office manager, April Peters, our event coordinator, Dion Worthy, our social media specialist, Allison Bland, and our technical specialist and audio engineer, Elio Leo. Remember, you can find this podcast and more by visiting our website, aas.princeton.edu. Thank you and take care.